but he's also the executive director of the USC Marshall Randall R. Kendrick Supply Chain Institute, Dr. Nick Vyas.
All right, I think the supply chain hiccups, the surprise was supposed to be here queued up, but you get to see me again. So I think what I wanted to talk about is supply chain outlook 2030. What are we seeing in terms of macro and micro trends? So let's get started. We do this on an annual basis, the research that we compile through the various data points and what it's showing us on the horizon scan by 2030. So can we get the... Just one second. So I think if we look at 2030, I think one thing we have to remember that if we learn anything from COVID, and we're likely to forget very shortly the implications that COVID has created on our civilization, that COVID can be summarized as a small blimp on our radar screen. So let me set that hypothesis. Some of the turbulence and headwinds that we see on the horizon that could be significantly devastating to our global network and global supply chain than what we have witnessed over the 4 years of the COVID pandemic. And there, I'm going to walk you through this, not to instill the fear, but rather, hopefully, intellectually stimulate the conversation over the next 2 days, that 3 major forces that we are actually seeing being brewing up on the horizon for us. And it's been for a while. So first and the foremost is the geopolitical. So when we think about geopolitical, since the Second World War, the global trade, if we look at it, has been a very peaceful. That is no longer guaranteed for next 70, 60, 50 years. And what does that mean? So we'll talk about. The second big component is the digital transformations. We often talk about that how quick the evolution of the technology impacting the human civilization. What we've yet to see, and we're going to talk about that, is that it is simply going to be a small minuscule of what we've seen from 80s into the 2000 of the dot-com into some of the frontiers of technology. We're looking at it, which is AI and its implication on civilization, but mostly we're going to focus over the next 2 days on AI. I think some fascinating applications that are brewing up of these digital forces. How will we adapt? How will you adapt? How will policymakers integrate those into their equation to make sure nobody's left behind the way what happened during the globalization boom? And a third and most critical piece that I think we're focusing on is the human capital, right? You cannot be at the higher institutions running an institute and not see how the people part of the equation needs to be integrated. If you combine these 3 pillars of forces and you understand and you compile those, you can have a significant impact of what supply chain 2030 is going to look like. So let me get started. Can I have my slide, because the screen over here is not giving me, I don't want to keep looking back. There's a, yeah. Just 1 second. So I wanted to sort of give you a quick nuances of each of these things, right? So this slide, we're looking at the geopolitical tensions, right? You think about the Red Sea, current crisis between the Houthis disrupting the flow, which is a small compared to when you start to think about this South China and Pacific Ocean trades coming into the Asia. If I multiply that and magnify that and create a what-if scenario, if some of the trade routes that we historically depend on it, imagine them being disrupted. Implication of that, what would that look like, right? And the history teaches us one thing: the greatest civilization fell not because they were completely demolished, but their supply chain routes were disrupted. You take away food, you take away essential raw material, you take away essential goods and commodities, and you succumbed those forces in a very desperate ways on civilization. So I think when we look at it, these issues of geopolitical issues, I think that's if one thing keeps me awake at night is how serious then this can actually evolve into the crisis on a magnitude that can supersede some of the implications we've witnessed on that. The growing cost. This is something you will realize that this is not about you getting attacked by phishing emails, but the organizations are constantly under threat. Jin typically cites the example that the Port of Los Angeles gets about 1 million plus cyber attacks on a weekly basis. So there are bad actors. They want to attack our grids, utilities, water. We're actually moving so much onto the cloud. Imagine the implications of data, which is multiplying by such a fast speed. How do we protect this? One of the most interesting research that I was part of it, that's policymakers in Washington, D.C. are concerned about it, is GPS satellites that we have, communication satellites we have. Think about bringing that kind of an infrastructure, hard infrastructure, and its implication on a soft infrastructure, right? So I think, again, this is not the points to scare, but I think what I would look for it in 2030 is your organization thinking through. Is your organization prepared? Are you prepared? Are you thinking through this what-if scenarios? And what does this mean for your business? So what is the outlook of the world economic outlook looks like, right? I mean, as we've seen, some of the fear in our country here was about recessionary pressure, but the retail numbers just came out yesterday and they were solid, right? So it looks like there is a fear of recession here, but the global economy is expected to be about at 3%, no longer at 4.5%, right? If we start to think 3% versus 4.5%, that's a significant reduction in a GDP. What will that equate depends on the region you are in, right? I mean, Asia obviously continues to dominate in terms of the personal spending, consumer spending, followed by North America, Europe, and then Latin America. So some of the key trends that we're focusing on it is onshoring. Jeff mentioned that in spring, we are actually hosting a symposium in Mexico City with AmCham and the Consul General of Mexico working with us. It's to talk about the USMCA, how that will actually help this trilateral agreement and into shaping the cross-border logistics between US and Mexico. Digital transformation, network, not only physical network, but the digital network. How will we shape those going forward when we talk about AI, ML, and some of the transformation that's happening in that space? this is a big piece that we are focusing on, which is traceability. There is no sustainability if we don't have the traceability, if you don't hold the stakeholders accountable for it, both positively and punitively. So how will this shape the narratives when we start to talk about the visibility and making sure the value system in the global trade is honest? That if something said made in Mexico, it's generally manufactured in Mexico and not assembled. Certain percentage of the value add activity are done there with certain rules and whatever those rules will be. And this is not just true from US standpoint. This is a global phenomena in which the trade agreements are going to be much more focused on the relationships and the value system than it will be on the business transaction. There is absolutely, without introducing waste. And many of you are going to be held accountable, especially if you're running publicly traded company, about the ESG, right? I mean, your KPIs are no longer creating profit only, but you will have to find that. Randy mentioned these things, and I'm going to bring this up about the infrastructure. First time in 40 years, US, we spent close to $3 trillion, or plan to spend $3 trillion. Obviously, it'll take a decade for us to actually bring this into first, to build physical infrastructure that was absolutely neglected. So when you start to think about, when we wrote the first white paper about decouplings of supply chain in 2014, I remember getting phone calls. People thought that I was smoking something. Because why would you want to decouple when things are just going and humming such a beautiful way? Obviously, I had no foresight of COVID. But those forces that I talked about it were there in 2014, that they exist in 2024, right? And no one can time it, but one can certainly build into the equation when you do the network design. What Randy talked about, 50 million square feet, completely carbon neutral manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. How does this big logistics cluster can help? It's a drop in a bucket, but it's a significant drop in a bucket. And I think we, as an institute, we are so good and so happy that our students will have an opportunity to work on this. Right, for those of you who follow the macro data, Mexico is now the biggest trading partner for US. So think of that. Diversification is happening. And this is not just, again, the narrative should never be that it's anti-China. It is about every region, every country has to think about the agility and resiliency as a part of the equation. So we certainly feel that this nearshore and onshore is going to continue to carry on the current trend. And in 2030, this is likely to be where regional nodes, they are not only independent, but they're interdependent. So in case one node breaks, other nodes can substitute the supply chain network, eliminating what we felt during the COVID. So a couple of quick things about the technology. So think about, we look back, for those of you who are old enough to know, when we started to put data on the cloud, many of us were very skeptical. Why would I want to put my data on the cloud? Why don't I have my savings account details and my stock portfolio printed and I can file it away? Today, we live completely on cloud, right? So think from that standpoint, where we are to where we're going. The transformation, digital transformation, either you like it, you love it, or you hate it. It's transforming itself. And the evolutionary curve is so rapid. So think of this chart that I'm showing you. Imagine this chart, right? Once you think about the logarithmic scale into the next 10 years, I mean, if you're not part of this change, you will be left behind. It's not about just the platforms and the communities and autonomy and autonomous system, all of these things being integrated to drive some critical decision, and the humans will assist as needed basis. This is a very different paradigm if you dissect this chart to than what we used to see. The transformation of .com and creating the entire e-commerce economy that today has quadrupled in less than 8 years. Imagine now the complete autonomous systems where the decision-making is done to the models, and a lot of the tracing and things that we human interact with can be done with this. So what does this mean? That this is the part of our ecosystem that we're going to have to adapt and learn and live, right? You getting a degree as an undergrad or a master's may be the good milestones, but if you don't continue to learn, what lifelong learning needs to be looked at it in terms of how do we stay current, how do we stay abreast, and what are the new things that we need to put into our portfolio so we can adapt. Obviously, AI is the theme of this conference. We are going to talk about AI for the next 2 days, right? Is this right, wrong? Does it have a benefits, risk? It's all of the above, right? Is it hyper talked? Is hyped? Is it myth, the mystery? I'll tell you that it actually has all of those components, but what I would propose that there is a serious applications being built around AI in many of the supply chain verticals. When we look at the S&OP, S&OE, procurement side to actually managing the customer interface and customer insight, right? Some of your buy decisions and the replenishment decisions. I mean, I can see so many examples where this will be integrated in our society. How does the human capital work with this? This chart, and I will publish this, but emphasizes that unless there is a top-down and bottom-up approach in which the government in each country takes this thing seriously, builds the policy, makes sure the human species are part of the equation and not the aftermath of the disaster that this could potentially create, will be a big, significant undertaking, right? It always reminds me about the globalization in the 80s and 90s. In the rust belt of this country, we left 40s and 50s and 60 years old men. They were hard workers. Factories were left completely empty. Jobs were shipped out. We didn't invest and retrain, reclassify them with the proper tools and training. Will we be caught again in this technology curve? And I hope not, because this could be 10 times more dangerous for a society. And let's face it, if you believe it, the global warming is real or not, personal view. The fact of the matter is that what we live today, some of the clear evidence of weather patterns suggests the supply chain has a huge role. In fact, 48% of the footprint of the carbon exposed is caused by practices that we actually, among us, deploy in our business today. So think about some changes we can adapt. What would that look like? Europe certainly leads this conversation about, I think, decade ahead of us. And the rest of the developing economy, obviously, they are trying to catch up, and their focus is their GDP and their growth. So they're not as focused as, but the Europe certainly is leading. It's a circular economy. Can we start to design things that can be at the end of the use decomposed to all the natural resources and reuse? A very different paradigm than recycling, right? It's actually building this in the design stage. So triple bottom line. I always preach this. If you are trained to think single dimension of profit or cost, I would challenge you today or next 2 days, adapt. Think about it. Can you deliver your networks What Grace, Das, and I, we talked about in this book, Supply Chain Network Design, is giving you use cases, example, how to build agile, resilient, and sustainable supply chain. But think about people, planet, and profit. And it's not one or the other. I think we can, as one of the most intelligent species on this planet Earth, we can figure this out together. Hopefully this conference over the next 2 days stimulates this thought, opens up the opportunity for each of us to look at it and say, how do we embrace beautiful, innovative futures ahead of us? And let's make it so that we can leave the legacy behind for our future generation and not regret what I could have, should have. Thank you very much. Enjoy the next 2 days. Thank you. And here is the surprise for you.